I realized very quickly I was joining a conversation that had been going on for years. That fear of asking that question, looking stupid, looking like you don't belong, looking like you don't understand. I've seen that apply across the board.
Welcome to Boardroom Confidential, a podcast by Sherpany, where business leaders tell the stories they usually only share with their peers. Each episode, we have 3 items on the agenda: pressure, lessons, and boardroom dynamics. I'm Emily Sheffield, communication specialist, broadcaster, former newspaper editor, and board member. And I'm looking forward to sitting down with senior leaders to talk about what really goes on behind the boardroom doors when the pressure's on and the stakes are high. Joining me this week is Terri Duhon. Terri started her career trading derivatives, and she is now a non-executive director and risk chair at both Rathbones and the money transfer company Wise. She's also an ambassador for Women on Boards, is a keynote speaker, author, entrepreneur, and guest lecturer at the London School of Economics and Oxford University. Welcome to the podcast, Terri.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the first item on our agenda is boardroom pressure. And what I didn't mention in that introduction was your roots. You grew up in rural Louisiana. Did you imagine one day that you'd be sitting on so many boards, including Morgan Stanley, which you sat on the board until only a week ago?
I definitely don't think I even knew what the boardroom was when I was growing up. But I used to play office a lot. So I cobbled together a desk and played office with an old, the old phones. You'll remember the ones you picked up and put on your ear. So I think it was foreshadowing for my future today, sitting in boardrooms.
And what's the most pressure you've ever felt in the boardroom?
Pressure in the boardroom is such a funny concept because ultimately the board is there to oversee. We provide oversight. And what we are relying upon is a great management team. We're relying upon the CEO. At the end of the day, our biggest job is to hire the right CEO, support him, challenge him, keep him motivated, him, her, they. If you are running the business, that's where the real pressure is. If you are overseeing the business, sitting in the boardroom, I think there's slightly less pressure. And so maybe we do feel pressure, but I'm always conscious that it must sit much heavier on the shoulders of the CEO and the exec team.
But what's the most pressure you've ever felt personally in a boardroom? Have you ever been in a situation where a company is collapsing or you're having to remove a CEO, or you found the team you've been working with very challenging? What was the most pressure that you've ever felt, and how did you manage that?
Well, I sit on highly regulated entities, and probably the pressure sits on my shoulders when the regulator comes in and is looking at whether we're compliant, whether we have good governance, whether we're all doing the job we're supposed to be doing. The thing that I'm always conscious of as a board member is that there's always another question you could ask. Whenever you go through a review of any sort where you're looking at, are we exercising good governance? And somebody says, well, did you ask that question? Well, did you ask this question? Well, why didn't you ask this question? And it's funny because you always think, well, there's always another question to ask. The better approach is to think, in that limited amount of time, what are the key questions we should be asking? And if we asked those questions, sure, we could have asked these as well, but there's not enough, you have to focus on that, you have to prioritize. And so the question is always, did we get the priorities right? Did we focus on the big issues at the right time? Did we dig in appropriately? And that is probably where the pressure is the highest, is when you look back. My job as risk chair, or anybody's job, anybody who chairs a committee, your job is to ensure that the right conversations are being had.
Have you ever felt there's been a moment where you didn't have the right level of expertise, and looking back now, maybe to sort of earlier periods in your career, do you think I should have done more research. My areas of expertise were not strong enough, and therefore I didn't ask the right questions.
Well, I am by no means an expert on everything in any boardroom I've ever been in. And probably anyone that comes to the boardroom and thinks they have to be an expert on everything and either tries to be or pretends to be or doesn't recognize that they aren't is, I think that's where there's a lot of risk. I remember when I first went onto the board of Morgan Stanley International, the chair at the time, he was a fantastically experienced person with a tremendous amount of governance and understanding of how boards should work. And he said to me, he said, you know what, Terri, don't worry if you don't understand anything on the first day. It's going to take you a year to really understand what's going on here. And I looked at him and I thought, well, maybe it took him a year. I mean, he was a regulator. He came into an investment bank. How could he understand what was really going on? I spent 10 years in a big investment bank. In fact, most of that time in a bank that looked very, very similar to this. And I had been a trader. I had been a derivative trader. I mean, if anybody understood what was going on, I was going to understand it. And I walked into the room and I realized, first off, I realized very quickly I was joining a conversation that had been going on for years. There was so much history to things that were being said that I had no idea. Second, there was so much vocabulary and acronyms. I was drowning in acronyms on day one. And then third, I was an expert on one thing, but the business was so much broader than that. And I needed to get my head around all of these other things. What I realized the longer I sat on the board is the longer I sat, the less I realized I knew. And the more I needed to rely on other expertise around the room and around the table, but also really understand how to ask questions about things in which I wasn't an expert. I had to be brave and ask those questions, which might sound simple, which might sound just I'm sorry, I didn't understand a word you just said. You're going to have to say that in language I speak.
I remember sitting on a board. I was on a board for 7 years, an international board, and in retail. And I suffered the acronyms for 2 years and even had a little sort of spreadsheet of acronyms. And still, when we sat in that board meeting, I was like, oh God, what are they talking about? Quickly look up my acronyms. And then eventually the chair turned around. He was much more experienced than me and a much bigger businessman. And he turned and he said to the person putting the board reports together, he said, I can't do this anymore. There's just too many acronyms. Can we just stop with all the acronyms? And I was like, yes. Why hadn't I said it? And of course, I'd been too shy and sort of thought, oh no, I can't be the one that brings up the acronyms. Everyone else seems fine with them. I've got to get with the program. And it turns out the whole boardroom went, oh yes, please. So it just shows you've got to say sometimes the obvious thing because lots of other people might be thinking it in the boardroom.
It's exactly what I was going to say. The number of times somebody has said something and I've been relieved, or I've said something and other people have been relieved. And they don't always, by the way, show it in the room, but often after the board meeting or after the committee meeting, they'll come up to you and say, thank you so much for asking that. I've been desperate to get to the end of it or to get to the bottom of this or better understand it. Or what I keep telling myself is I'm a thoughtful person. I've done the reading. And if I don't understand it, it's probably not me. It is probably, there's a reason. And so either somebody hasn't taken me through something or I have missed something big, but more than likely, we all need to break it down a little more.
We're next going to go up to boardroom lessons, and the board's role is to hold executives accountable. And as you say, look at the risk, ask the right questions. I think one of the big challenges is framing those questions so they don't seem like an attack. So they're not too soft so they can wriggle out of it. And also, if you are the one that ends up asking the questions that no one wants to ask in the room, how do you do it in a way that doesn't set you up as the bad cop?
Such a good question. Such a good question. I think you can see boards evolve. If you have the same people in the room over time, you can see people settling into specific roles. This person asks the difficult questions. This person asks the details. This person focuses on the human element, falling into those predictable patterns. Maybe that makes it easier for everybody around the room, but I think it also means that ultimately you end up with one or two people providing the same questions over and over. And maybe they're not heard sometimes because it's the same question in the same voice. And actually, it needs to move around the room a bit. One of the things that I do in my risk committees, which helps me a lot as chair, is I have a non-executive only session for 30 minutes before the risk committee. And we go around the room and I say, okay, what struck you? What are you worried about in this? What came out of this pack that makes you worried? What do we need to dig into? Who should ask that question? I don't always get it right. And sometimes we run out of time. But I try to get different people around the table to ask different questions. And sometimes we've been successful. So we'll say, okay, look, this person and this person are always focused on this. How about you? The CEO really feels quite connected to you. Can you ask the question? Can you do it, in a way that you think is gonna help? And so it's actually trying to change it up a bit in terms of who talks about what, because then it's a different voice. And most of the time when someone says something, and in a committee or in a board meeting of any sort, if you disagree, you speak up, right? If you disagree, you say, actually, I'm not really sure about that. Maybe it's something different. But if you agree and you feel like the point's been made, you don't make it again. So many, many times what we're missing is that although it's one person saying something, everybody else must be in agreement, or else they would say not. They would speak up otherwise. That's their job.
A lot of this is incumbent on a good chair, don't you think? I mean, a good chair will move voices around the room. They
Yes.
will, if someone who is making the same point about financial risk, let's say, the chair should be trying to garner agreement and other opinions around the room. I mean, I think a good chair can really make the difference between an effective board and a fairly ineffective board.
I agree with entirely. And the skill set is so broad for being a chair. It's how you prepare for the meeting. It's how you think about the agenda. It's how you engage with the teams that are presenting. It's how you get feedback. So it's not just when you're in the room. And there's so many different elements of how to do something well. It's a constant learning experience. There's always something, and I think, I could do this better. I could do this. I'm going to think about this a little more. And trying to get feedback afterwards. Well, what did you think? Did you think what was good? What was bad? Always trying to get that feedback. And what I find is that at the same time, the business is changing, the people are changing, the external environment is changing. And so we have to shift and we have to focus on this thing now. And so being a good chair is hard. And for sure, we don't all get it right. And for sure, those who think about it the most and are trying to get it right are probably closer than if you just sit back and you're complacent. But it's sitting on a board. I don't think you can have that complacency anymore. You heard about boards that were highly complacent, years ago, pre-08, right? I just don't think that's the conversation. That's the boardroom we're in anymore. It's a group of people who are more keen to do a better job.
Now, the final item on our agenda is boardroom dynamics. I was really interested because you're an ambassador for the organisation Women on Boards. I wondered if you'd had experience or there is advice you give to women about making themselves heard. What have been your key learnings that you now share with other women?
Most of my career, and even back at university, I have been in very male-dominated spaces. More recently, what I'm noticing is that the boards I'm on have an increasing number of women. I am looking for more diversity, more diverse background, more diverse experiences to bring to the table, and more diverse perspectives. And I think that's very powerful for a boardroom. I have kind of mentored a number of people, a number of women and diverse candidates, just a number of people into the boardroom. I don't know that I've made a distinction in how I've done that for men versus women. What's more interesting to me is that imposter syndrome is something many people feel, and it's not just gender specific. And I see it come up in a bunch of different ways in a bunch of different places. And it's actually back to the earlier conversation we had about asking what is considered the stupid question in the room. Nobody wants to ask that question. And that fear of asking that question, looking stupid, looking like you don't belong, looking like you don't understand, I've seen that apply across the board to people with so many different backgrounds. I haven't felt the need or seen any examples of anything that I've needed to say differently than I would say to anyone else. The women I've worked with have just been amazing. And I guess what that says to us is that there are so many talented people out there who could sit on a board. And it's pretty awesome to get to work with people from all of those different backgrounds. It's super fun. I learn something every single time I sit in a boardroom. I think, God, I wouldn't have asked that question. I can't believe they saw that. That's super interesting. It's just so valuable.
It's been such a pleasure hearing your stories and your insights, Terri. And we always finish with one final question. And that's, if you could go back to your first board meeting, what would you tell yourself?
I would have told myself to be brave, be a little bolder. I still think to this day of the first Morgan Stanley board meeting I went to, and I didn't say a single word, where the questions I had noted down to ask, with hindsight, I still wish I had asked them. And, I should have just been brave. And what I have noticed is that when people who first join boards and they're in their first meeting and they have something to say and they just throw it out there, and they don't get all of it right, but it's such a new perspective that it's great to hear. And what I have made a point of is that when I'm on a board and a new person comes on, afterwards I try to say, wow, those were great, really glad you're on board, just to give them the confidence, just to remind them that their perspective is important, it's different, it's unique, and we really welcome it. I had one person come on and say, he said, yeah, look, this is just like a drive-by here because I've been on this board 2 seconds, but here's my take. And it was always very valuable. And his setting himself up as saying, look, this is like a drive-by because I have 2 seconds of background, it wasn't an apology. It was just remember the context here, guys. I've been here 2 seconds. It was just something to learn from anyway.
Terri Duhon, thank you so much for sharing your boardroom stories with us and giving us your time and commitment.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to Boardroom Confidential, a podcast by Sherpany. Sherpany is a leading meeting management solution designed to meet the unique needs of the board committee, and executive meetings. Find out more at sherpany.com. And make sure you subscribe to the Boardroom Confidential podcast to hear more business leaders tell the stories they usually only share with their peers.